Fort Worth, Texas, in 1974, was a city balancing on the edge of tradition and change. The post-war era had given rise to suburban neighborhoods, bustling schools, and a sense of community that many residents cherished. Main streets were lined with small businesses, diners, and bowling alleys, which had become gathering places for teenagers and young adults alike. In this city of familiar faces and quiet streets, 17-year-old Carla Jan Walker lived a life that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. Yet, beneath the surface, her story was about to intersect with a tragedy that would haunt the city for nearly half a century. Carla grew up in a household marked by warmth, structure, and a subtle but powerful sense of expectation. Her father, Robert Walker, was a man of steady resolve, working long hours to provide for the family. He taught Carla the importance of responsibility, perseverance, and moral integrity. Her mother, Mary Walker, was gentle yet firm, encouraging curiosity, creativity, and independence. In a household where both parents balanced discipline with affection, Carla learned to navigate the world with confidence and empathy. Her younger brother, Jim, looked up to her in ways typical of siblings, trusting in her guidance, sharing in her laughter, and mourning with her when small disappointments arose. To those who knew her, Carla was not merely a daughter and sister. She was a young woman defined by intelligence, warmth, and an energy that drew people toward her. Academically, Carla was a diligent student, balancing her schoolwork with extracurricular activities. At Western Hills High School, she was known as a bright, friendly, and socially engaged teenager. She had a knack for making friends, not in a superficial way, but through genuine interest in others and a readiness to listen. She joined the cheerleading squad, an activity that not only showcased her athletic ability, but also reinforced her standing among peers. Cheerleading was more than a sport for her, it was an avenue for building confidence, a place where she could connect with others who shared her drive and determination. Beyond school, Carla had dreams that extended far beyond Fort Worth. She imagined a future filled with opportunities, relationships, and experiences that would allow her to leave her mark on the world. Her ambitions were those of a teenager, fueled by hope and a sense of possibility. The social fabric of Fort Worth at the time contributed to Carla's experiences. Suburban life encouraged teenagers to gather in local establishments, from diners to bowling alleys, places where young people could unwind, socialize, and participate in the shared rituals of adolescence. The Ridgely Bowl, located in a quiet neighborhood not far from Carla's home, was one such place. Its neon lights flickered in the evenings, offering a semblance of warmth against the winter chill. Families and teenagers alike found comfort in its routine, unaware of the shadows that could linger even in ordinary settings. Valentine's Day 1974 began like any other. Carla and her friends were excited for the school dance, a highlight of the winter social calendar. Decorations in the gymnasium were simple yet festive. Red and pink hearts, streamers hanging from the ceiling, and music that pulsed with the excitement of youth. Teens dressed in semi-formal attire moved across the dance floor, laughter mixing with the notes of popular songs. For Carla, the evening was meant to be a celebration, a chance to enjoy companionship and perhaps flirt with the prospects of romance, as teenagers often do. Her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, was a central figure in that night's narrative, their relationship typical of young love, playful teasing, shared smiles, and moments of quiet tenderness. After the dance, Carla and Rodney decided to make a brief stop at the parking lot of the Ridgely Bowl. For most teenagers, it would have been a moment of normalcy, a place to talk, maybe plan their next outing, or simply sit in the comfort of each other's company. The sky above was clear, and the winter air bit at the skin, carrying with it the scents of nearby streets, tires on asphalt, and the faint aroma of food from the alley's snack bar. The lot was largely empty, save for the vehicles of a few late-night bowlers. The neon sign flickered above them, its light a pale reflection against the chrome of parked cars. It was quiet, safe, and seemingly unremarkable. But within minutes, the ordinary transformed into a nightmare. A man appeared at the passenger side of their car, described by witnesses as a white male roughly 5'10". In a matter of moments, Rodney McCoy was struck, rendered unconscious, and the safety he had taken for granted vanished. Carla was forcibly removed from the vehicle, her voice echoing in the night as she screamed for help. The surreal terror of the moment left Rodney disoriented, alone, and terrified. Her purse was left behind, abandoned in the asphalt shadows, and nearby lay a .22 Ruger magazine, a seemingly small detail that would later prove crucial in linking a suspect to the crime. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Rodney, regaining consciousness, struggled to comprehend what had occurred. His own injuries, though temporary, were the first in a series of hardships that would follow him for decades. Police were contacted almost immediately. Local law enforcement arrived at the scene quickly, joined by friends, neighbors, and members of the community eager to help. Flyers were distributed across the city. Every lead was chased, every witness interviewed, but as the hours turned into days, hope began to wane. News stations broadcast the story, bringing attention not only to the Walker family's plight, but to the broader concern of public safety in Fort Worth. On February 20th, Carla's body was discovered in a culvert along Pearl Ranch Road, near what is now Lake Benbrook. The discovery was a shockwave across the city. The local police documented the crime meticulously, gathering physical evidence for an investigation that would initially rely on the technology available in 1974. Witness interviews, physical evidence collection, and traditional detective work. In those days, the resources available for forensic analysis were limited, but investigators remained committed to finding the person responsible. The presence of the magazine, the state of the scene, and other evidence pieces were preserved carefully, forming the foundation for a case that would remain unresolved for decades. The Walker family was devastated. Jim Walker often recalls that the period following Carla's disappearance was marked by sleepless nights, uncertainty, and a grief that was compounded by the absence of answers. For Robert and Mary Walker, the pain of watching their daughter's friends and community mourn, while simultaneously feeling powerless to bring justice, was unbearable. They became advocates for continued investigation, refusing to let the tragedy fade into obscurity. Their persistence would ultimately play a role in the eventual breakthrough decades later. Fort Worth's residents were left with fear and questions. The community grappled with the realization that a crime of such severity could happen in their midst, in what many considered a safe and familiar neighborhood. Parents questioned the security of public spaces, teenagers reconsidered the freedom they had taken for granted, and local authorities were pressured to solve a case that had captured the city's attention. Flyers, community meetings, and media coverage highlighted the desperation for answers, but the limitations of forensic science in the 1970s meant that justice could not be immediate. The night of February 14th, 1974, was meant to be filled with youthful joy. Instead, it became the starting point of a decades-long journey, a narrative of tragedy, persistence, and eventual resolution. Carla Walker's life, full of potential and promise, was abruptly ended, leaving behind grief, questions, and a community forever changed. Before we move further into the investigation and cold case years, take a moment to subscribe and click the notification bell. By doing so, you can stay updated with other cold cases finally solved after decades, and share where you're watching from in the comments below. The discovery of Carla's body sent shockwaves through Fort Worth. Detectives arrived at the culvert on Pearl Ranch Road with a mixture of urgency and solemnity, aware that the case was far more than just a missing person report. Carla had been a teenager whose life had barely begun, and the crime's violent nature demanded immediate attention. Investigators carefully documented the scene, noting physical evidence, positioning of her belongings, and items left behind. Among the critical pieces of evidence was the .22 Ruger magazine, a detail that would later prove pivotal in identifying the perpetrator. Every detail was recorded meticulously. Photographs were taken, sketches drawn, and evidence sealed for future examination. Within hours, law enforcement canvassed neighborhoods near the Ridgecliff Bowl, interviewing patrons, employees, and anyone who might have seen unusual activity. Eyewitnesses described a man roughly 5'10", white, who had appeared suddenly and acted aggressively. Rodney McCoy, Carla's boyfriend, provided the most direct account of the attack, though his injuries complicated his recollection. Police took his statement carefully, ensuring he was medically attended to while capturing the critical details of the abduction. His account described the shock of a normal night, turning catastrophic in seconds, his voice trembling as he recounted the moments he could remember. Among the first persons of interest was Glenn Samuel McCurley, who lived in proximity to the bowling alley. McCurley owned a .22 Ruger, the same type as the magazine found at the scene. Detectives interviewed him in April 1974 at his home, about 2 months after the crime. He claimed the firearm had been stolen while he was fishing, a plausible story at the time given the limitations of record-keeping and law enforcement technology. To further clear suspicion, McCurley submitted to a polygraph test, which he passed. The investigators, constrained by the science of the era, had little reason to pursue him further and shifted focus to other leads. While modern observers may recognize missed opportunities, law enforcement operated within the scope of available evidence and resources. Public involvement in the case was significant. Flyers with Carla's photo circulated across Fort Worth neighborhoods. Media coverage was extensive, with local television stations running segments that highlighted the search efforts and asked citizens to come forward with tips. Newspapers printed detailed accounts of the disappearance and the discovery of her body, emphasizing the shock and tragedy of the event. Community members organized search parties, and parents grew more vigilant about their children's whereabouts. The incident disrupted the city's sense of safety, introducing a cautious awareness among residents that violent crime could strike even in seemingly ordinary settings. Despite numerous leads, the investigation faced repeated dead ends. In 1977, a man at a Tennessee police station confessed to Carla's murder. However, inconsistencies in his account led authorities to doubt the credibility of his confession, and he later retracted it entirely. Investigators dismissed the claim, frustrated by yet another promising lead evaporating into uncertainty. A decade later, law enforcement received a cryptic, handwritten letter claiming responsibility under a pseudonym. Blank killed Carla Walker in Benbrook. It is hard to say, but it is true. The message ended with a coded signature, baffling the police. Despite the publicity and curiosity it generated, the letter produced no verifiable leads. As the years passed, Fort Worth police maintained the evidence, filing it carefully in the cold case unit. Physical samples were stored under controlled conditions, from the clothing collected at the scene to the original magazine and other items that could one day be useful for analysis. Investigators, while reassigned to other cases or retiring, left behind records meticulously documenting every lead pursued and every avenue explored. The Walker family, though grieving, remained vigilant, checking in periodically with law enforcement and advocating for renewed attention whenever possible. Jim Walker described the toll this took on the family. Every year that passed without an answer felt like a fresh wound. We kept hoping, but there were moments when hope seemed impossible. The city itself adapted to the unresolved nature of the crime. Neighborhood watch programs gained attention, and parents increasingly monitored the movements of their children. High school dances and public gatherings were tinged with cautious awareness, and the Ridgeglia Bowl, once a place of carefree teenage leisure, carried the invisible weight of memory. Residents who had been teenagers in 1974 recounted the event to subsequent generations, reminding them that the city had endured a tragedy that left questions unanswered for decades. Carla's disappearance became part of the local lore, not sensationalized for shock value, but respected as a cautionary tale about the fragility of safety and the importance of community vigilance. During the cold case years, advances in forensic technology were minimal compared to later breakthroughs, yet each passing decade brought new possibilities. DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, and high-sensitivity testing were still years away, but the careful preservation of evidence ensured that the potential for resolution remained. Police detectives from the original investigation continued to maintain institutional memory, leaving comprehensive notes, photographs, and records that would eventually allow future investigators to reconstruct the case with precision. Public memory of the case faded somewhat over time, but Carla's family never let it disappear. Jim Walker frequently attended school reunions, community meetings, and interviews to keep his sister's story in the public eye. He became an advocate not just for her memory, but for other cold case victims, emphasizing the importance of never abandoning justice. Friends, classmates, and neighbors recounted their memories, speaking of Carla's vivacity, kindness, and the simple joys of her life. These remembrances humanized the case, ensuring that the narrative remained centered on the life lost, rather than solely on the crime itself. In addition to personal and community efforts, the media occasionally revisited the case, producing documentaries and news specials highlighting unresolved crimes in Fort Worth. Each feature underscored both the tragedy and the limitations of forensic science at the time. Experts discussed the nature of cold cases, explaining that without preserved biological evidence or reliable leads, resolution was often impossible. Yet these retrospectives also planted the seeds for future innovation, drawing attention to the potential of modern methods to finally answer questions left unanswered for decades. Take a moment to comment below what you think would be the most challenging aspect of waiting decades for justice. And if you haven't yet, make sure to like this video, supporting the effort to shed light on cases that remained unsolved for far too long. Engagement like this ensures that cold cases continue to receive public attention and support, which can ultimately aid in their resolution. By the early 21st century, Fort Worth had changed significantly. Streets were busier, neighborhoods transformed, and the city's population had grown. Yet the cold case files remained, quietly preserved in storage, carrying evidence from crimes like Carla Walker's, waiting for science and persistence to uncover their secrets. Detectives assigned to the cold case unit periodically reviewed these files, but it wasn't until 2019 that technological advances converged with opportunity in a way that would finally break open Carla's case. The journey from the 1970s to the modern era was marked by both patience and frustration. Families of victims often navigated bureaucratic hurdles, evolving laws, and limitations in technology, all while carrying the emotional burden of unresolved loss. In Carla's case, decades of preservation, documentation, and public memory combined to create the foundation for a breakthrough, even after nearly half a century of silence. The cold case period also illuminated societal attitudes toward crime and victims. The community's ongoing engagement, media coverage, and advocacy by family members highlighted the importance of public awareness in sustaining investigative momentum. In many ways, Carla's story became a reference point for other investigations, demonstrating that even when the immediate leads ran cold, evidence, memory, and determination could remain alive. Decades had passed since February 1974, yet the case of Carla Walker lingered quietly in the archives of the Fort Worth Police Department. Evidence had been meticulously preserved, and notes from the original investigation were maintained with care, a testament to the diligence of detectives past. Yet, for 45 years, the crime remained unsolved. It wasn't for lack of effort. Technology simply hadn't caught up. DNA profiling was decades away, and genetic genealogy was still confined to the imagination of futurists. For the Walker family, each passing year deepened both sorrow and hope, a duality familiar to families of cold case victims across the nation. It was in 2019 that the trajectory of this cold case shifted dramatically. The Fort Worth Police Department's dedicated cold case unit, led by detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett, reopened Carla's file with renewed determination. These investigators, seasoned by decades of experience and the latest scientific advancements, approached the case with a strategy that combined meticulous review of historical evidence with modern forensic possibilities. They knew that if there was any chance of solving a case frozen in time, it lay in DNA technology that could extract meaningful profiles even from decades-old, degraded samples. The physical evidence, carefully stored since 1974, included clothing items, undergarments, the discarded magazine, and other items collected from the crime scene. In prior decades, these samples had been catalogued and frozen, ensuring that they remained viable for future analysis. Detective Wagner, reflecting on the case, recognized that these decades-old samples held the key. "We always believed that science would eventually allow us to tell Carla's story fully. We just had to wait for the tools to catch up." The investigators partnered with Othram Incorporated, a private laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis and working extensively with degraded or historically collected evidence. In April 2020, clothing and other preserved items were submitted for testing. Scientists at Othram employed highly sensitive extraction methods, capable of retrieving DNA from fragments long thought unusable. The process was painstaking, involving multiple rounds of cleaning, amplification, and sequencing. Every step required care. Contamination could invalidate the effort, and the stakes were nothing short of decades-long justice for a murdered teenager. Initial analysis produced a DNA profile of high quality, yet cross-referencing it with the national database, CODIS, returned no matches. This was not unusual for a case of this age. Many perpetrators of crimes in the 1970s had never been profiled or had their DNA entered into modern databases. Faced with this challenge, the investigators turned to genetic genealogy, a tool that had recently revolutionized cold case work. By comparing DNA sequences with profiles in public genealogy databases, they sought familial connections that could point toward the perpetrator. This method, while groundbreaking, was meticulous and often required months of analysis, sifting through family trees, historical records, and probability calculations to narrow down potential suspects. After careful investigation, the team identified a promising lead: the family of Glenn Samuel McCurley. At this point, nearly 46 years had passed since the crime. McCurley, now in his late 70s, had lived decades of ordinary life, seemingly free from suspicion. Investigators knew they needed irrefutable confirmation before moving forward. They implemented a common forensic tactic: the collection of discarded items containing DNA. Detectives obtained cups, bottles, and other personal items from McCurley's residence without his knowledge, carefully preserving the chain of custody. Testing these items confirmed the match. DNA from the crime scene exactly corresponded with the DNA collected from McCurley's discarded items. On September 4, 2020, laboratory analysis provided the definitive link needed for law enforcement. Detectives moved swiftly, understanding the gravity and sensitivity of the case. On September 10th, investigators arrived unannounced at McCurley's home. They collected a DNA sample via a cheek swab, following the proper legal procedures, which again confirmed a match to the decades-old crime scene evidence. At 77 years old, McCurley was confronted with the reality that the crime he had committed in 1974 could no longer hide behind the passage of time. On September 22nd, 46 years after Carla Walker's murder, Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested and charged with capital murder. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through Fort Worth and beyond. Headlines highlighted the arrest of a man whose crime had eluded justice for nearly half a century. For the community, the story was both tragic and awe-inspiring. The realization that justice could indeed reach across decades offered both relief and renewed faith in law enforcement. The Walker family experienced a profound mix of emotions. Jim Walker, who had grown from a young boy into a man waiting decades for resolution, described the moment as surreal. After 46 years, we finally had a name and a face. It doesn't bring her back, but it brings acknowledgement. Detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett were widely praised for their persistence and for leveraging modern technology to achieve justice. Their meticulous work demonstrated the value of preserving evidence, institutional memory, and employing innovative scientific methods. The case became a landmark example for other cold case units across the country, illustrating the profound impact of forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators emphasized that without the preserved evidence, careful documentation, and advances in DNA analysis, the case might never have been resolved. Comment below what your first reaction would have been if a case like this was solved in your hometown after decades. And while you're at it, hit the like button to support stories that shed light on long unsolved cases. The arrest set in motion legal proceedings that were as remarkable for their swiftness as for their historical significance. McCurley initially entered a plea of not guilty, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming DNA evidence. The Tarrant County District Attorney's Office prepared for trial, compiling a body of evidence that included historical records, witness statements, and the modern forensic DNA analysis that linked McCurley definitively to the crime scene. Prosecutors highlighted the meticulous preservation of evidence and the consistency of historical details, creating a compelling narrative for the courtroom. In August 2021, the trial began. On the third day, in a courtroom filled with journalists, family members, and curious citizens, McCurley made a stunning decision. He changed his plea to guilty, effectively waiving a jury trial. The judge, Elizabeth Beach, presided over the proceedings and evaluated the evidence, the plea, and the statements of Carla's family. McCurley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The DA's office decided not to pursue the death penalty, respecting the Walker family's wishes and acknowledging the symbolic closure offered by permanent incarceration. For Carla's family, the verdict provided a bittersweet form of justice. It did not erase the decades of grief, nor did it restore the life that had been stolen. Yet, it validated the years of hope, advocacy, and emotional endurance they had sustained. Jim Walker remarked that while nothing could undo the past, the conviction represented recognition. It shows the world that her life mattered, and that justice, no matter how delayed, can still be achieved. The implications of this case extended beyond the Walker family. The resolution reinvigorated interest in cold case investigations nationwide. Lawmakers, inspired by the successful application of forensic genealogy, introduced the Carla Walker Act in 2025, a legislative proposal allocating federal funding for cold case investigations using DNA technology. Police departments across the United States recognized the strategic value of preserving evidence, documenting leads meticulously, and revisiting cases as technology advanced. While the conviction answered the primary question of who, some aspects of the case remain enigmatic. Investigators continue to speculate whether McCurley may have been involved in other incidents in Fort Worth during the 1970s and 80s. The anonymous letter that surfaced decades after the crime, claiming responsibility, remains a mystery. These unanswered questions serve as reminders that while justice can be achieved, not all threads of a criminal act are fully unraveled. The courtroom in Fort Worth on the morning of August 21, 2021, was a quiet theater of anticipation. Decades had passed since a 17-year-old girl named Carla Walker was abducted from a parking lot, and yet the memory of that night remained vivid among those who followed the case closely. Friends, neighbors, and local residents filled the public gallery, while journalists arranged cameras to capture each procedural moment. Carla's family sat together in the front row, their expressions a mixture of anticipation, grief, and cautious hope. For Jim Walker, it was surreal to witness 46 years of unanswered questions distilled into a single, tangible proceeding. Glenn Samuel McCurley, at 78 years old, appeared calm yet visibly aware of the gravity of the moment. His demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension and emotion surrounding him. The presiding judge, Elizabeth Beach, addressed the court with clarity, outlining the procedures and the evidence that had led to this trial. She emphasized that the plea to guilty waived a jury trial, but did not eliminate the necessity of reviewing the evidence and understanding the timeline of events. Prosecutors methodically presented the case. They displayed preserved photographs from 1974, demonstrating the locations, objects, and initial investigation steps. They recounted the timeline of events from the dance at Western Hills High School to the stop at Ridgecliff Bowl, the abduction, and the subsequent discovery of Carla's body. Witness statements, including Rodney McCoy's first-hand account, were presented alongside the chain of custody for critical evidence items. Most notably, the DNA evidence obtained via modern forensic genetic genealogy was highlighted as definitive. Prosecutors detailed the scientific process, explaining how decades-old samples were meticulously analyzed, matched through discarded items, collected legally from McCurley's residence, and cross-referenced with public databases to identify familial links. The courtroom was silent as the DNA analysis was explained. Many in attendance, including some journalists and legal observers, had followed cold case breakthroughs using genealogy in high-profile cases, but had rarely seen the method applied to a case nearly half a century old. The clarity and precision of the science resonated with the audience. Decades-old evidence, carefully preserved and analyzed with modern techniques, could finally bring closure to a crime long thought unsolvable. The defense was brief. McCurley initially attempted to maintain his innocence, but the overwhelming nature of the evidence rendered further contest unnecessary. In a moment that caught many by surprise, he ultimately changed his plea to guilty, formally acknowledging responsibility for the capital murder of Carla Walker. The presiding judge, Elizabeth Beach, then pronounced the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision reflected the community's and the family's desire for accountability and permanent protection from future harm, rather than pursuit of the death penalty. As the gavel struck, a collective exhale passed through the courtroom. Carla's family, long burdened by grief, experienced a sense of closure that had been unimaginable for decades. Jim Walker, reflecting afterward, stated, "It's not a happy day. You can never get back what was lost, but it is justice, and that counts. We finally have recognition for Carla, and that matters." For the Walker family, the trial was not simply a legal procedure. It was the culmination of decades of advocacy, hope, and unwavering commitment to ensuring that Carla's story was never forgotten. The community of Fort Worth reacted with a mixture of shock, relief, and reflection. Local news outlets covered the sentencing extensively, emphasizing the rarity of resolving a 46-year-old cold case. Residents remembered their own fears from 1974 and expressed admiration for law enforcement's persistence. Social media platforms and comment sections reflected public fascination and empathy, with many noting that the case demonstrated the enduring power of science and patience. The story also inspired conversations nationwide about cold cases, the value of DNA genealogy, and the importance of not allowing unresolved crimes to fade into oblivion. Beyond the courtroom and community, the impact of the Carla Walker case extended into legislative advocacy. In 2025, inspired by the successful resolution of her case, lawmakers introduced the Carla Walker Act, a proposal that sought to provide federal grants to support cold case investigations using forensic genetic genealogy. The act emphasized the importance of preserving evidence, supporting specialized lab work, and ensuring that unsolved crimes are given renewed attention. Law enforcement agencies across the United States looked to Fort Worth as a model, understanding that modern forensic techniques could resurrect investigations long thought dormant. Despite the closure provided by the conviction, the case left lingering questions. Some investigators speculated whether McCurley may have been involved in other criminal acts during the 1970s and 80s, though no additional charges were ever filed. The anonymous letter discovered decades later, claiming responsibility under a coded signature, remains unsolved, adding a layer of enduring mystery. For the Walker family, these uncertainties did not diminish the satisfaction of seeing justice achieved, but they serve as reminders that even with resolution, some aspects of human experience remain complex and unresolved. The story of Carla Walker highlights profound lessons about justice, science, and persistence. It demonstrates that even when decades pass, accountability is possible. The meticulous preservation of evidence, the careful documentation of investigative steps, and the commitment of dedicated detectives were all essential in solving a case that had baffled authorities for nearly half a century. Moreover, it illustrates that the grief of families, though enduring, can be validated and acknowledged through careful, ethical pursuit of truth. For those interested in the evolution of forensic science, this case serves as a textbook example of how genetic genealogy transformed cold case work. Previously unthinkable in 1974, these techniques now provide law enforcement with the tools to connect decades-old evidence to living relatives, identify perpetrators, and finally deliver closure to families. Detectives Wagner and Bennett emphasized that the combination of historical diligence and modern innovation was critical. The past could not be rewritten, but it could be understood, and justice could be enacted. As viewers reflect on Carla's story, there is a message of resilience and hope. Justice delayed, though painful, is not justice denied. Families waiting decades for answers are reminded that persistence, advocacy, and technological progress can intersect to reveal truths that once seemed buried forever. Communities are reminded of the value of preserving memory, maintaining public attention, and supporting investigative efforts even when immediate results are elusive. Carla Walker's life, though tragically cut short, became a catalyst for change, education, and reform in the realm of cold case investigations. As we close this narrative, consider this. How would you respond if a case like this was solved in your own community decades after it occurred? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of cold cases finally solved, bringing long-delayed justice into the light. Carla Walker's story, while tragic, ultimately demonstrates the power of human persistence, scientific advancement, and the societal commitment to ensuring that no case, no matter how old, is beyond the reach of justice. Her life, her family's perseverance, and the dedication of investigators serve as enduring reminders that truth, though sometimes delayed, has a way of coming to light.